Welcome back to the History Whisperer. When we think of Vikings, we see legendary warriors and ships full of treasure. But behind the legends, life in the frozen north was a brutal, unending battle for survival. Why was it so hard to stay alive in the world of the Norsemen? Before we journey into the cold, please subscribe and like this video if you find peace in our stories. Now, lean back and let the history whisper to you. How about going silently far away before closing your eyes? Centuries ago, a village between snowy mountains where icy winds blow and fires burn quietly inside stone houses. Welcome to the world of the Vikings. Today, we are traveling to one of the harsh climates of the past. But do not worry, no one will swing a sword at you in this story. We will not cross the ocean with longships. Just closing your eyes and listening is enough, because this channel exists to prepare you for sleep. If you are here for the first time, welcome. We love telling history peacefully, calmly, and without war or noise. And if our voice feels good to you, do not forget to subscribe. We are here with a new story every day. You can support us by joining our channel, and we can decide on these journeys together by leaving a comment. We grow with your contributions, and every comment is like a map for us. It helps us find our next stop. Now take a deep breath. Slowly leave the weight on your shoulders on the ground. You can close your eyes or just dim the screen, because a long journey awaits you. Tonight, we will explain why Vikings had to be resilient, rather than just strong. And we will see together how tough, how simple, but at the same time, how exhausting the life they lived was. Sometimes with heroism, sometimes with hunger, sometimes with war. But mostly, we want to make these people, who struggled with the cold, a part of our sleepless nights, not just history books. In this content, there are no war cries for you, but you will be accompanied by the icy mornings behind those war cries, the fires they lit with semi-frozen hands, and perhaps most of all, the inner voice of a Viking woman praying silently. Why were the Vikings so resilient against hardships? Why was life so difficult for them? And why was there never a comfortable world for them? We will now slowly seek the answers to these questions, between consciousness and unconsciousness, at that sweet threshold of sleep. History will be the guide, not only of the past, but also of sleep. If you are ready, let us begin. Harsh living conditions. When night fell, the wind would become more merciless. The roar seeping through the roofs of the wooden houses sounded like a familiar folk song to the ears of the elderly. The fury of the north was remembered anew every year. It was the same tonight. A small Viking village of 10 houses, squeezed between the fjords, was preparing to sleep silently under the snow. But the snow here was not like a guest bringing sleep, but one waiting. The cold seeping through the night entered under the doors. It roamed under the wooden floors, touching not the skin, but the soul of man. In one of the houses in the village, old Astrid was telling stories to her grandson, sitting at her knees. As every winter night, she spoke of the gods first. Then she told of that great storm that came just before summer. And finally, she silently remembered the night her husband, Bjorn, was lost in a blizzard years ago. Astrid's voice trembled slightly, but there was no fear. The people of these lands had learned to experience fear like the cold, because in the north, one did not fight with nature. One did not stand against it. One lived with it. Life for the Vikings meant constant struggle. But this struggle was not always with wars. It was mostly with nature. Life in the harsh geography of the Scandinavian peninsula was full of difficulties that modern humans cannot even imagine. Winter months were long and merciless. On some days, the sun would appear for only a few hours and then disappear again. As the nights grew longer, time slowed down. And with this slowness, people would sink into thoughts. Sometimes the difference between night and day would vanish, and only the cold would remain. Life for the Vikings meant constant struggle. But this struggle was not always with wars. It was mostly with nature. Life in the harsh geography of the Scandinavian peninsula was full of difficulties that modern humans cannot even imagine. Winter months were long and merciless. On some days, the sun would appear for only a few hours and then disappear again. As the nights grew longer, time slowed down. And with this slowness, people would sink into thoughts. Sometimes the difference between night and day would vanish, and only the cold would remain. Houses were simple, plain, and functional. They were generally structures with stone foundations, wooden walls, and thatched roofs. There was a hearth in the center. This fire was both for food and for heating. However, the heat radiated only around the fire. In the corners of the house, breaths turned into steam. The wind seeped under the doors, roaming inside the house like an invisible guest. People tried to protect themselves with thick wool, hides, and layered clothing. But the cold was the kind that passed through the skin and reached the bone. Children would wake up at night to throw wood into the stove, interrupting their sleep, just like Astrid's grandson. While throwing wood with his small hands, he would resist sleep on the one hand and feel the cold even in his dreams on the other. The soil was as merciless as the air. Farming was almost impossible. The surface of the soil would remain frozen for months. With the arrival of spring, sowing would be done quickly. If harvesting was not done in a short time, the products would either freeze or rot. Preparing for winter started in the summer, but no preparation was ever complete, because what the north would bring was never certain. Provisions were carefully stored, fish were dried, and meats were salted. Still, sometimes the food in the cellars would run out, and hunger would come to the door. But hunger did not shout. It waited silently, just like the cold. As the nights grew longer, people turned inward. Stories were told of the wrath of the gods, wars with giants, the bright halls of Valhalla. These narratives were spoken not only to entertain children, but also to keep adults connected to life. Because darkness sometimes accumulates not only outside, but also inside a person. That is why Astrid told every story carefully. She would specifically remember the god Freyr, the god of spring and fertility. She would say that if Freyr is forgotten, winter grows longer. Because sometimes even hope warmed a person. One did not fight the cold. One only adapted. Vikings accepted nature not as an enemy, but as a power. They determined direction by the sound of the wind and made weather forecasts by the flight of birds. They did not try to go against nature. They moved together with it. That is why they could survive. Every movement, every preparation, every thought was shaped according to nature. Every family would have stacked their wood before winter began. Doors were reinforced, clothes were repaired. The inside of the house was prepared for winter. And yet, everyone was a little anxious as winter approached. Because no matter how much you prepared, the North had its own rule. It always takes more. Over time, people would change. As winter passed, faces grew pale and eyes grew sleepless. But the Vikings would get used to it. Every spring when it arrived, the chimneys of some houses would not smoke. Winter did not let everyone go. But those who remained would start again. Because living here meant simply surviving. Grandsons would grow up, learn not to be afraid of the darkness, and take over throwing wood into the stove. Astrid's house was a witness to this cycle. As the night ended, her little grandson finally slowly fell asleep. The flames of the stove were flickering. It was still snowing outside. But inside, stories and memories kept their warmth. Perhaps this was the strongest side of the North, teaching endurance by challenging people. Vikings were never a people who defeated the cold, but they were a people who learned to live with the cold. That is why they were not forgotten throughout history. The merciless climate of the North both broke and molded them. For that reason, on the face of every Viking, there were the silent but deep lines of a year washed with snow. These lands had long nights, strong winds, and stingy soil. But the Vikings managed to take root in all of this, because enduring was not just a necessity for them, it was a tradition. Sometimes the night began not with cold, but with silence. There was no wind. It wasn't snowing. The sky had become invisible behind the clouds, but it was inside. Everything inside the house was slowly freezing. Not only the skin, but thoughts were shivering too. In those ancient Viking villages in northern Scandinavia, where long nights became ordinary, staying warm was not a comfort, but a way of survival. Therefore, every movement was measured, every material precious, every fire sacred. Because when the night came, nothing was ordinary. The structure of the houses was shaped according to the harshness of this climate. Wooden walls set on thick stone foundations, roofs insulated with straw, openings plastered with mud on the inside. But none of these efforts could prevent the wind from seeping in. Cold always finds a way. It entered not through the walls, but through the silence. There was a small hearth in the middle of the houses. Soup would boil on it. Wood embers would glow beneath it. But the fire offered warmth only to the people near it. By the time it reached the corners of the house, even breath would become steam and cling to the walls like dew. Therefore, Vikings did not rely only on fire to stay warm. They planned their bodies, their clothes, and their domestic arrangements for this purpose. Woolen undershirts, felt trousers, blankets surrounded by animal hides. Dressing in layers was not a habit, but a tradition. Especially before sleeping at night, it wasn't the warmth of the last layer of hide worn, but the feeling of safety coming from within that hide that brought sleep. Because a person took their warmth not only from heat, but from the order they were used to. Every garment, every layer had a meaning, a past. A cloak left from a grandfather, a glove sewn by a mother. These were not just items, but traces of survival. Lying down was a preparation in itself. Floor beds were usually spread in the corner of the house closest to the stove. Straw was spread under them. Woolen mattresses were placed on top. Family members often lay together close to each other. Warmth was preserved not only by fire, but by heat passing from body to body. Children would be in the middle, the elderly in the corners. Everyone's place was certain. This arrangement created a collective resistance against the night's cold. In some houses, dogs were also taken in. While large furry animals lay next to people, it was possible to warm up with their heat too. Animals were precious not only for hunting, but also for warmth at night. Even a dog's breath could be enough to resist a morning about to freeze. That's why Vikings saw animals as companions. The cold was the same for everyone, not just for humans. In the later hours of the night, the fire must not go out. This task was usually given to one of the youngest in the house. Staying awake or waking up at intervals, checking the logs, stoking the embers, relighting them if necessary. This silent task was not applauded by anyone, but it was vital, because if the fire went out, everyone's sleep would shiver, and it would be difficult to reach the morning. Fire was not just heat, but hope, like a small sign of life winking in the darkness. Coping with the cold was not only a physical, but a mental preparation. People would pray at night. They would wish for abundance from the god Freyr. They would ask Thor to protect their homes. Praying both filled the silence and calmed the mind. Sometimes prayer became a sentence of hope. Sometimes it turned into a story told in a whisper. These stories were not to put children to sleep, but to talk with the darkness. Because sometimes a person was afraid not of the cold, but of the silence. In Astrid's house, this ritual continued that night as well. Her grandson had woken up toward morning and thrown a few small branches into the stove with sleepy eyes. His eyes were half closed. The flames dancing inside the stove illuminated the inside of his eyelids. Then he wrapped himself in his blanket and curled up next to his grandmother. Astrid was trying to warm the child's hair with her breath. Meanwhile, she was silently humming a song. That song was not a lullaby passed from generation to generation, but a silent prayer for making it to morning. Staying warm on icy nights was not limited to the struggle inside the house. There were those who stayed outside, those returning late from hunting, those returning by walking along the frozen riverbank. For this reason, small lamps were placed next to the doors, left burning throughout the night, so that if someone found their way, they could see the light. Vikings knew how to look out for each other despite the harsh conditions. The cold treated everyone equally because the nights were long and the hours were heavy. But the morning would somehow dawn, and when the morning came, while the last drop of steam from the stove was still rising toward the ceiling, people would begin to live again. Warmth never truly arrived, but habit slowly covered the person. Hands still felt cold, breath still produced steam, but the soul got a bit more used to it every morning. For the Vikings, warmth was not a fire, but an attitude. It was a form of existence provided by resistance, patience, and living together. Perhaps that's why they never said the places they lived were warm, but they continued by saying, quote, 0, because surviving here was not only a physical, but a spiritual resistance. And this resistance began anew every morning with a handful of embers. Sometimes, no matter how much effort was put into the soil, there was no return. The sun would vanish behind the clouds. Rain would either never come or suddenly overflow. It would descend upon the seeds with fury. In these lands, farming was a job done not with nature, but with nature's mercy. And nature was not always generous to the Vikings. In the northern lands, where summers were short, the period they could get crops consisted of only a few months. In those months, the whims of the sky would determine the fate of the coming year. The hope that started in the field on a summer morning could fade with a few weeks of drought. On a stormy night, all the crops could be flattened. An early frost could destroy whatever had turned green. When the harvest was weak, a silence would begin in the village. No one would say it openly, but everyone knew. Winter was going to be hard. Famine was the oldest acquaintance of this people. No one knew when it would come, but it was certain that it would visit one day. Whispers in the houses increased. The pantry was counted. Dried fish and salted meats were checked one by one. Every piece of food was now more precious. Every bite stored more carefully. Hunger did not come immediately. First, daily portions would shrink. Priority was given to children. The elderly was not prior and operated. The daily was given to prosoup of the daily of the very bet. The daily was given to imposition of the meats and salt. First, daily portions would shrink, prepare for one of the bet. The bloodly method as active and prior. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. First, daily portions would shrink and prepare for one by one. Were to children, the elderly voluntarily ate less. Dairy animals were not slaughtered, because milk was a more long-term food than meat. Over time, more water and less grain were put into the soup. Stale bread was grated and kneaded again. Remaining bones were boiled repeatedly. Sometimes only fish broth was drunk for days, if fish could be found. Some families would start collecting wild herbs, mushrooms, and even tree bark in the forest. Some plants could be poisonous, but wisdom raced with hunger. Ancient knowledge would come into play. Which leaf was to be collected at what time, with what it should be boiled so as not to cause harm. These were silent prescriptions passed from generation to generation, from ear to ear. While nature starved on one hand, it offered ways of survival on the other. As long as your eyes are open, your hands careful, and your mind calm. As hunger increased, animals would also start to decrease, one by one. First the chickens, then the goats. The cattle were kept until the very end, because they were not just meat, but also partners in the field. Losing them meant risking not just one winter, but the following summer as well. For that reason, many families sat at their tables with memories instead of meat. People were quieter, movements were slower, and conversations were less cheerful. Some winters were so difficult that help was sought from neighboring villages. But usually, everyone would be in the same situation, because famine was a guest that affected not just one house, but the entire region. Bartering would come to the fore once again. Furs were given for a bag of barley. A hunting dog was traded for a piece of butter. Everything turned into a survival strategy. In those periods, the most valuable currency was a full stomach. Hunger consumed not only the body, but also the thoughts. People could not dream or make plans for the future. They lived only with the idea of making it to the morning. Nights were longer, and sleep was lighter. When the stomach was empty, the soul seemed closer to the ground. Some would pray, some would stay silent, but everyone silently held the same wish: let spring come as soon as possible. Spring meant not just green leaves, but hope, a chance to start over, and the possibility of being fed. The greatest test of famine was given through the children, because they did not yet know how to be patient. They did not understand how precious it was to be full. Mothers would try to make plates look fuller by decorating them, and split a single morsel in two while telling a fairy tale. Hunger was read not from their tongues, but from their eyes, and these eyes showed the true resilience of the Viking society. Hardship was not only physical. The resilience of the soul was more valuable than that of the body. When spring finally arrived, the first green grass was not only in the soil, but inside the people as well. The first bread, the first hot soup. These were not celebrated like a victory, but there was a silent joy in every house. When the pantry began to fill again, the things winter had taken were slowly replaced. But every famine left a mark. People did not forget. Preparation for the next winter began even earlier because Vikings knew hunger does not forget. It can knock on the door at any moment. The houses where the Vikings lived were structures shaped by that harsh geography, sharp winds, and long winters. When viewed from the outside, these houses looked ordinary, even a bit gloomy. Low roofs, windowless walls, dark stone foundations, and bodies woven from thick wooden logs. But in reality, each of them resembled silent fortresses designed for survival. Because the northern cold was felt not just outside, but inside as well. And those houses were the Vikings' only protection from the world. A Viking house was often rectangular in shape. These structures, called longhouses, could sometimes reach lengths exceeding 10 or 30 meters. Their foundations were reinforced with stone, but the primary material was wood. Thick logs cut from the surrounding forests were placed on top of each other. Plastering a mixture of mud and straw between them, they tried to prevent the wind from seeping in. The roof would be sloped both so that snow would not accumulate and so that the smoke inside could rise. Viking house roofs were generally covered with reeds or turf. This provided both insulation and a look in harmony with nature. Over time, grass would grow on the roofs of some houses, and birds would build nests. These silent, slow-growing traces of life actually showed that the house lived in harmony with nature. But life inside was not always this calm. Right in the middle of the houses, there was usually a hearth buried in the ground. This fireplace was the heart of the entire house. Both food was cooked here, and heating was provided from here. There were no chimneys. Smoke would exit through holes in the roof. These holes also distributed light. During the daytime, a dim light filtering through that opening would fall inside the house, giving a slight silhouette to the dark corners and creating flickering shadows on the walls. Those shadows sometimes merged with the sound of the fire, making the interior of the house move like a living being. There were no rooms in the house. Everything was within one large area. Beds in one corner, provisions in another, and the fire in the middle. Beds consisted of woolen mattresses placed on boards spread with straw. Family members lay close to each other. This was important not only for bonding, but also for sharing warmth. While cold settled by the walls at night, the living area in the middle would warm up even if just a little. Struggling with the cold was possible not only with fire, but also by being close to one another. Furniture was extremely simple. Wooden tables, small chairs, handmade shelves. Every piece of furniture had a function. It was far from concepts like decoration or ostentation. When entering the houses, the first thing felt was not emptiness, but function. Everything was as it should be, neither more nor less. On the shelves there would be clay vessels, leather bags, and bundles of dried herbs on the walls. This simple order was a simplicity developed against the hardship of life. Chaos was a loss of energy. Order was a condition for survival. Sometimes animals were also taken into the houses. Especially during periods when winter was very harsh, small livestock were kept in a partition at the back of the house. Their warmth would soften the air inside a bit more. At the same time, it was a way to protect these animals from freezing. Between human and animal, there was a partnership of destiny, not just work. When you entered a Viking house and sat by the fire, the thickness of the walls would not completely protect you from the cold, but it would block the wind. Silence would sometimes be so deep that even the crackling of the fire sounded like a song to the ear. Sometimes it merged with a story told by an elder, sometimes with a mother's whispered prayer. These houses were not made of just stone and wood. Inside them was a life woven with patience, resilience, and silence. For Vikings, a house meant something beyond just shelter or refuge. In those houses, generations grew up. Winters were spent. Summer plans were made. Returns from voyages were celebrated, and losses were silently bid farewell. Every wall represented a memory, and every crack represented a winter. Therefore, these houses did not fight the cold. They lived with it. These homes were kept warm not by passing through the cold, but by accepting it. And that is why, although Viking houses appeared simple from the outside, they carried a heart beating with silent determination within. In the midst of the trio of stone, wood, and cold, fire was the only thing that protected a person's soul. And that fire burned not only with wood, but with the power of living together. Being a child in Viking villages did not much resemble childhood in today's sense. In that world, games were short and responsibilities began early. Nature was harsh, the weather was cold, and life did not wait for anyone for long. Therefore, Viking children were mixed into life almost as soon as they were born. Cradles were not for rocking, but were short breaks for resting. Because every child growing up in those houses met the realities of life from a young age. A child's first job was to observe. Whatever the adults were doing, the children would watch them. If a mother was milking a goat, the daughter would stand beside her and memorize her movements. If a father was weaving a net, the son would learn to untie the string on the side. No one would tell them, quote, one, because growing up here was not a matter of age, but about how harshly time passed. And sometimes a single winter would take a child out of childhood and push them into adulthood. A child who reaches the age of 5 would now be involved in the household chores. They would carry wood, fetch water for the animals, knead the mother's yogurt, and organize the hunting bag prepared by the father. While girls learned from their mothers how to cook, sew, and prepare healing with herbs, boys would at least know how a spear was held, if not how to carry a sword. Because war could come to the door at any moment, and everyone, male or female, would have a responsibility. There were games, of course, but these games were actually preparations. Young children played with toys made of bone pieces and miniature shields. If you were a girl, you wouldn't role-play being a mother with rag dolls, but with blankets made of cloth, rehearsing being a mother. Even play was a preparation for reality, because in this society, there was no luxury such as being caught unprepared. Education was given within life, not at school desks. Every piece of information was learned through practice. A child would learn which herb was edible and which was poisonous, when which animal would be hunted, and in what weather it was dangerous to go out, not by asking the elders, but by watching them. This observational knowledge sometimes turned into an intuition that could not be learned from books, because a child growing up with nature would perceive life by instinct. As time passed, children began to carry their own responsibilities. Girls looked after younger siblings, cooked, and organized the house. Boys sometimes went hunting with their fathers and sometimes helped with shipbuilding. A boy who reached the age of 13 was now considered a small man. Some participated in expeditions at that age, and some carried their own pickaxes in the field. Because in this society, age was measured by ability. If you had the strength, you had your place. But in the midst of all these hardships, the inner voices of the children never went completely silent. Steps running silently in the streets covered with snow, tasks turning into wood-carrying games, small stories told to each other by the flames. The smiles of Viking children were perhaps few, but their hopes were great. Because being a child in the Viking world meant both carrying weight and learning to survive. And this teaching would continue throughout one's life. A girl would quietly ask while learning to knit wool at her mother's knee. Quote 2. Her mother would say, smiling. Quote 3. The same child would wrap her younger sibling in that wool she knitted a few years later. She would become a shield against the cold. A young boy would memorize every word coming out of his father's mouth. If there is sun, there is no north wind, his father would say. And this word would become a compass years later that would determine in which direction he would steer the ship. Being a child in this society was not just the first step of growing up, but a guarantee for a society to survive into the future. Because the Vikings had stood their ground not only with their swords, but with the resilience they gave to their children. Those children grew up with necessity, not by force. That is why they matured early, but never aged early. Because living started early here, but it didn't have to end early. Society and threats. For the Vikings, danger was close at any moment, not just on the open seas, but on the lands they lived. In those long valleys that were silent by day and dark by night, the threat sometimes came with a roar of the wind and sometimes knocked on the door without making any sound at all. Rivalry between tribes, scarce resources, and a social order that never allowed honor to be broken forced Vikings to live constantly on guard. Disputes occurring inside rather than enemies coming from outside were the cause of the greatest raids. Although every village had established its own order within itself, shields would be in hand immediately when this order clashed with another village. Land sharing, border violations, areas where animals grazed, discussions starting because of these could suddenly turn into an attack one night after silences lasting for days. Raids were mostly done at night, because at night the sound of the wind hid the actual footsteps, and with the darkness it was not clear who was coming from where. Suddenly, shouts would rise in the village. Animals would flee screaming. One of the houses would start to burn. Vikings were always prepared for these raids, but this preparation did not mean peace. There would be a spear in a corner of every house. Shields usually hung by the entrance door, and swords were never placed far away. Even children knew where to hide in an emergency. Women would quietly place a stick behind the door and keep water ready to stifle the fire, not the wood to stoke the burning fire. Because the fire inside the house was also a target. An enemy seeing the smoke would immediately understand where life was. These attacks were sometimes bloody, sometimes fast. Sometimes only a few sheep would be stolen and gone. Sometimes a house would be leveled. But every raid left a mark, not just material but spiritual. After every attack, there would be silence for a while. People would not speak or make eye contact, because every pain required a few days of silence. A lost father, a burned barn, or a kidnapped child. These wounds did not heal easily. And revenge in the Viking world was not just a right, but a duty. Therefore, one raid would follow another. This cyclical tension between tribes also shaped the mental world of the Vikings. Nothing was permanent. If there was peace today, it could be broken tomorrow. That's why everything was thought of with redundancies. Extra salt in the pantries, a horse ready to flee in the barn, a food bag hidden in the attic. These had become reflexes, not just precautions, because living meant being prepared, and a village caught unprepared could not easily recover again. Raids created not just physical but spiritual exhaustion. Being constantly alert, flinching with every sound at the door, noticing the direction of the wind, sensing that something was approaching by looking at the sky. These were the daily states of the Viking people. Adults taught children not only how to shoot arrows, but also how to remain silent at night. Because surviving was sometimes about not making a sound, not throwing a stone, and in the midst of all this, people continued to live. Toward morning, a father, tired but standing upright, would check on his children. Is the door solid? Is the fire out? Is everyone in their place? These small checks were actually a great ownership of life. Because for the Vikings, a house was not just a shelter, but a protected area. And this area was defended again every night. Knowing that the enemy would come was easier than not knowing when they would come. Uncertainty broke sleep, but sleeplessness was a price this people was used to. This tension between tribes didn't just bring destruction. It also created a state of vitality and preparation. People became sharper, their attention increased, and the sense of unity strengthened. Perhaps that's why the Viking society could remain so resilient. Every hardship made them even more solid, and every raid united them a bit more. Because when the threat came from outside, it strengthened the bonds inside. In the end, Vikings lived intertwined with war not only on the seas, but also in their own villages. But this state of war did not frighten them. On the contrary, it shaped them. Constant danger was not a threat to them, but a reality. And this reality was the most distinct part of the Viking spirit. Waking up before the sun rose was a habit of a Viking warrior. Sleep was short, the night was cold, and the morning was silent. While everyone was still asleep, he would walk slowly outside the house and breathe in the scent of the earth. If the ground had become heavy after the rain, it meant it was not a suitable time for hunting. If the wind blew hard, archery training became difficult. But no weather condition would hinder a warrior's preparation. Because preparation in the Viking world was not just a routine, it was life itself. In the mornings, the first task was checking the weapons. The sword, spear, and shield were each personally inspected. They would look to see if the handle was sturdy or if the edge had dulled. Because a warrior's weapon was not only a tool for defense, it was his honor. A rusty sword or messy armor showed the owner's carelessness. Yet a Viking warrior always had to be ready. It was never known when the call to war would come. Perhaps in an hour, perhaps in a week. But when it came, no one had the right to say. Quote 5. The later hours of the day usually passed with training. Young warriors threw spears, defended with shields, and sometimes fought each other with wooden swords under the supervision of the elders. These trainings were harsh but real, because Vikings knew that war was not a game. A mistake meant the end in a real battle. Therefore, every movement was repeated dozens of times. One learned not only how to raise a sword, but also when not to raise it. Patience was the greatest power, and sometimes knowing not to use the sword was more valuable than using it. A Viking warrior had to be strong not only physically, but also mentally. That is why listening to the stories told by the village elders in the evenings was just as important. These stories did not only tell of past heroisms, they also whispered concepts like strategy, honor, betrayal, and loyalty into the ear. Every story was a previously lived version of a decision to be made in the future. To listen was to think, and a warrior should not swing a sword without thinking. During the day, practical tasks were also performed. Warriors were involved not only in fighting, but also in shipbuilding, hunting, and blacksmithing. Because in the Viking world, specialties were interconnected. A warrior had to know how to repair his own armor and make his own axe. Someone boarding a ship did not just row. He read the wind and found direction by looking at the stars. When necessary, he cast nets, caught fish, lit fires, and boiled water. Life was multifaceted at every moment, just like war. When evening came, everyone gathered around the campfire. The exhaustion of the day was shared around those silent flames, sometimes with joy, sometimes with silence, but always with a sense of unity. Tired shoulders turned toward the fire, eyes looked into the darkness, and hands habitually touched the handles of weapons, because the night was as full of threats as the day. A Viking warrior had to know how to fight by day, and how to be ready even while resting at night. When sleep came, it was deep but short-lived. Dreams were often silent, because a warrior's mind calculated even in sleep. From which direction will the wind blow in the morning? Which road is safer? Which is open to an ambush? Sometimes even a voice of an enemy was heard within sleep. But this voice was not real. It was just the mind's way of staying alert. Because for Viking warriors, peace came through being ready for war, and life was a march as sharp as a sword and as long as patience. For Vikings, justice was not always ensured through written rules. Honor was at the center of society, and when a shadow fell upon that honor, what came with the shadow was not just resentment, but a necessity, revenge. Because living in those lands was not just about survival, but about remaining righteous. And the way to remain righteous was often a harsh response following a silent wait. A dispute arising between tribes or between two families in the same village could easily turn into a blood feud. The theft of an animal, the misunderstanding of a word, or even a slight bruise to one's honor was enough to start the chain. First, a look would change. Then greetings would be cut off. Then the silent wait would begin. Everyone would know what was going to happen, but no one would take the first step. Because the first step was the beginning of the end. Revenge was not a right in Viking society. Sometimes it was a duty. When a member of a family was killed, the survivors did not just carry the pain, they felt compelled to strike back to honor them. Preparations were made silently. Swords were sharpened, horses were fed. Which trail to take at night was known without being spoken. This silence was the oldest language of pain, because Vikings expressed pain not by shouting, but by taking action. But revenge was never taken in haste, because a mistake could destroy not only the opponent, but also one's own family. That is why some revenges were postponed for years. A child would grow up, become a man, and set out to take his father's revenge. This was seen as a ceremony. The honor of the lineage was measured by the individual's patience and strength, and this patience could sometimes last a lifetime. Blood feuds did not remain only between two people. Families, villages, and sometimes entire tribes were drawn into this spiral. Every attack brought a new response, and every response brought a new wound. This chain would lengthen, continuing with nothing but blood, even for an original cause that no one remembered. That is why some Viking communities tried to break this cycle with a practice called weregild, or blood price. Peace was sought by giving goods, animals, or silver in exchange for someone killed. But not every family would accept this, because some wounds could not be closed with gold. Women were both silent carriers and secret guides in this process. Sometimes a sentence whispered by a mother into her son's ear, sometimes a reproach in a wife's eyes would light the flame of revenge. And sometimes women represented a fortitude greater than revenge, forgiveness. But forgiving was a brave choice in this society, because the one who forgives does not merely pardon someone. They confront their own honor. The shadow of revenge was long. It was enough to break sleep and silently wrap around the nights. Many Vikings could not find peace without confronting their enemy. Therefore, wars were experienced not only outside, but also inside. There was an internal struggle moving between conscience and tradition, between patience and anger. And sometimes the real war was fought with the anger held inside rather than the enemy outside. But the peace that came with revenge was often short-lived, because every blood spilled created a new debt. Vikings knew this. That is why some withdrew to protect their own lineage and settled for a new beginning. But the past did not fall silent easily. The land where blood flowed did not know how to forget. Revenge and blood feuds were like the branches of a tree under whose shadow the Vikings grew. Every branch carried a different story, and every leaf a different face. And the roots of this tree were connected to memory, not to the soil. Therefore, in those lands, people walked with respect not only for their enemies, but also for their own memories. In the Viking world, honor was carried like a name. When a person was born, they did not just receive a name. At the same time, they shouldered the reputation of their family, what had been done in the past, and what was expected of them to do in the future. Honor was like an invisible armor. Sometimes it protected, sometimes it felt heavy, but it could never be taken off. Because for the Vikings, a life without honor was no different from a dead body. In society, there were rules that everyone knew and accepted, but were unwritten. If a man did not keep his word, if he cheated in trade, or if he left his friend alone on the battlefield, this was not just a small mistake. It would be an indelible stain. And this stain would infect not only himself, but also his lineage. Therefore, every behavior and every decision was taken considering not only today, but also tomorrow. When someone's name was mentioned, the kind of trace they left behind was much more important than a gravestone. Honor was not a responsibility belonging only to men. Viking women were also carriers of this concept. Protecting the family, raising children, and ensuring the integrity of the house was a duty of honor. Some women would take up arms when necessary and keep a house standing alone when necessary. For them, reputation was a resistance maintained silently. Being strong was not equivalent to shouting, but to not giving up. Sometimes a warrior's life would end for the sake of his honor. Fear of death remained light beside the fear of shame. Because a brave death was needed to go to Valhalla, the heaven of warriors. Someone who fled cowardly or left his friend halfway through would not even be remembered when he died. However, someone who stood tall, even if he did not strike the final blow to his enemy, would be told of for generations. Death for Vikings was not an end, but the seal of a life lived correctly. Honor was also balance. If a person could be patient when angry, if he could answer the injustice done to him at the right time, if he could establish consistency between his word and his action, that person would receive respect. Having wealth or power was not enough. What mattered was how he carried that power. Because Vikings believed that power was temporary and honor was permanent. At large celebrations, after returning from voyages, or at funerals, what people talked about most was not the number of heroisms, but how they were done. No matter how well a sword was used, the intention behind it shaped the result. Defeating the enemy without deceiving them, winning without crushing the weak. These were the things that created true reputation. Throughout life, everyone's goal was clear: to leave a name that would be remembered with respect, so that children could carry their father's names with pride, so that spouses could remember their partner's word while holding their heads high, so that neighbors could say, "He's gone, but he left his honor here." All effort was for this. Material inheritances would be temporary, but a name would remain on the ground for a long time like snow. Sooner or later it would melt, but it would leave a trace. When a Viking woke up in the morning, he would think not only about what he would eat or where he would go, but also how he wanted to be remembered. Because in that geography, life was short, conditions were harsh, and trials were many. But someone who lived with honor, whether he was a warrior or a farmer, was always in the same place in the eyes of society. Respect was gained not only with the sword, but in behavior. Therefore, Vikings lived for honor and died for it when necessary. To fear death was to give up reputation, and they knew it. Life was temporary, but a good name, even if it did not last forever, would be remembered for a long time. If there was a wind whispering his name over the cold lands, a Viking was considered to have truly lived. For Vikings, death was not always the most feared thing, because falling on the battlefield was to earn a place beside the gods. But there was a punishment that was even heavier than death's: being cast out of society. This punishment, known as utlager, meant a person was removed not only from his village, but also from his humanity. Now his name would not be mentioned, he would not be greeted, his house would be emptied, and gazes would be averted from him. Being alone was colder than the harsh climate of the north. Being cast out of society was always the result of a crime. But the conscience of society was as effective as the nature of the crime. Illicit gain, murder, behaviors that would stain honor, or consciously drowning a family in shame. Each of these was sufficient reason for being an utlager. This decision was usually made in the popular assembly called the Thing. The crowd gathered, evidence was heard, witnesses spoke, and finally the community decided whether they could live together or not. And if the decision was negative, what was given was not a prison sentence, but silence, an endless and painful loneliness. When the punishment was notified, the person could no longer return home, hug his family, or use his own name. Even someone who spoke to him, gave him food, or hid him would be punished in the same way. Therefore, being cast out of society was to erase a person while he was alive. Neither friend nor enemy remained by his side. Mountains, forests, and stone roads would now be his only companions. When some faced this punishment, they took refuge in the mountains, lived by hunting, and tried to survive. But living alone in the Viking geography was almost impossible. Loneliness was more challenging than a full stomach, because to survive in that society, unity was required, not just shelter. Being alone in the days when winter approached meant a person gradually disappearing. For someone cast out of society, the greatest punishment was not physical, but spiritual. He could no longer share his story with anyone, could not sit around anyone's fire. His name was not mentioned at a table. These people sometimes lived, sometimes failed to survive. But some of them returned years later and either paid a great penance or dedicated their lives to someone's forgiveness to be accepted again. Because in Viking society, honor was not taken back immediately once lost. But sometimes years of loneliness could soften a heart and have a story rewritten. This punishment was like a silent fear inside everyone. Because for the Vikings, the family, the village, and the society were the most important existences after the human body. If this bond broke, the person would fall apart too. Therefore, every movement was done carefully, and every decision was thought of through the eyes of others. Being alone was like being without fire in the middle of the wind. It could be managed for a while, but eventually it would silently freeze a person. Being cast out of society was not a body being sent out, but a soul being forgotten. And for the Vikings, being forgotten was even heavier than deaths, because a name that was not mentioned was considered not to have lived. That's why every Viking strove not only to live bravely, but to grow old together, to be buried together, to be remembered together. And therefore, everyone knew internally, to remain outside of society was not only to fall away, but to be erased in the darkness, nature, and travel difficulties. For Vikings, the sea was not just a road. At the same time, it was a test. Every voyage was not just going from one place to another, but facing the dark face of nature again. Setting out to sea required courage, but beyond courage, acceptance. Because the wind could turn, the sky could close, and the waters could suddenly rise and become so wild as to swallow the ship. And Vikings would set out knowing this. They fought the sea with every stroke of the oar, but never as an enemy, with respect, because the ocean would either carry them or swallow them. There was no definite boundary between the two. Ships were the heart of Viking life. Long ships, drakars, with their dragon-headed forms, were designed not only to strike fear, but to be one with the sea. They were light but durable. They were built on that thin line between gliding over a wave and being stuck in the middle of a storm. There were rowers on every ship. Rowing was not just a matter of strength, it was a matter of rhythm. Every stroke had to follow the other. Every breath had to harmonize with the one in front. This synchrony carried not just speed, but also hope. Journeys lasted weeks, sometimes months. The route was not always clear. There was no compass. They relied on the sun, the stars, the birds, and the smell of the water. Experience was more valuable than a map. A Viking captain could sense an approaching storm, by looking at the color of the sky and how far the shore was from the flight of a seagull. This intuition was not just knowledge, but the result of a long-standing relationship with life. They had learned to talk to the sea, but it did not always answer. Life at sea could not be compared to the comfort on land. The space was narrow, the weather was cold, and food was limited. Fish were caught, salted meats were stored, and water was consumed drop by drop. Every day passed with the same faces and the same movements. They slept in the open at night. The sky served as a blanket, but even it was often covered with clouds. Sleep was light because everyone might need to be awake at a moment when the ship was on the verge of capsizing. When storms began, not only the ship, but also internal balance was tested. Seasickness was the fate of most Vikings. Nausea, weakness, headache. But no one would complain about this, because at sea it was resilience that spoke, not complaints. Someone showing weakness put not only their own safety, but everyone on the ship at risk. Therefore, most Vikings carried their pain inside, vomited, but did not let go of the oar. Fighting with silence was more valuable than whining out loud, and over time, that silence would become one with the water and echo inside the person. Sometimes ships would get caught in a storm and lose their direction for days. The horizon line would disappear, and night and day could not be distinguished. The rain did not wash the face, it hurt the skin. Waves passed over the knees, filling the interior with water. In these moments, everyone's eyes turned to the captain, because the captain gave not only direction but also hope. With a single look, he could say, "We are continuing," and that word would be stronger than the wave. Sometimes Vikings returning from an expedition returned with silence, not just with salty winds from the sea, because everything experienced there could not be told. The sea carried memory, not just water, and some memories settled into the depth of the eyes, not the tongue. That is why those who returned did not speak. They would just sit in front of the fire and remain silent while warming their hands. What they experienced was understood in silence. For Vikings, fighting the sea was not only a physical struggle, but an education of the soul. Patience, harmony, resilience, and acceptance. These were learned along with the waves, and most importantly, no voyage was guaranteed. Every journey meant either returning home or blending into eternity. That's why every Viking whispered a farewell to themselves while setting out to sea. As if to say, quote 8, "The northern wind did not just blow. It whispered, it dragged, it hid. Sometimes it touched the ear as if showing a direction. And sometimes it filled with a roar enough to make one forget everything, drowning out sounds." For Vikings, the wind was not just a natural phenomenon, but a test. Because getting lost in the north, relying only on stars and instinct when there was no compass, was walking on a thin line drawn between life and death. And that line was often invisible. When Vikings setting out on the roads moved for trade, war, discovery, or migration, they would set out as if making a pact with nature. Without knowing what would happen, but feeling what they might encounter, the north winds often hit their faces, trimmed their eyelashes, and sent chills through their bones. With that wind, the sky would darken, clouds would change direction, paths would be erased, and suddenly a familiar forest could turn into an unknown labyrinth. A Viking who lost his way was lost not only in geography, but also in time. Days were similar to each other. The difference between morning and noon, evening and night became blurred. The sound of the wind changed the rhythm of the steps. Nothing could be heard but the sounds of nature. Friends' voices drifted away. When left alone, only the inner voice could be heard. That silence was the moment a person confronted himself. Some disappeared in the fog. Fog was the most silent and deceptive curtain of the north. It covered everything like an invisible wall, destroying the sense of direction. Sometimes your fingers seemed to disappear even if you reached out your hand. Fog tested the patience and serenity of Vikings. To panic meant turning down the wrong path. Therefore, a lost Viking had to learn to stop rather than walk. The wind played the same game not only in the forest, but also at sea. It would change direction in an instant, swell the sail, and divert the ship. For a captain without a compass, the only guide was the sky. But north winds often came with clouds. Neither the sun nor the stars were visible. In those moments, captains tried to find the direction with their intuition, making decisions by reading the color of the sea, the flight of birds, and the severity of the wave. But still, some expeditions deviated from the route and were dragged to other shores. And this drifting sometimes brought new lands and sometimes turned into the silent beginning of extinction. Getting lost in north winds was more than a physical distance. It was an internal dissolution. A lone Viking recognized fear, learned patience, and necessarily understood how to move with nature rather than against it. These vanishings were sometimes journeys with no return, and sometimes the simplest form of survival. Because finding the direction was a matter of the heart, not just the feet. Some Vikings returned days after being lost. There was mud on them, fatigue on their faces, but a kind of silence in their eyes. That silence showed that what was experienced was too deep to be told. Some never returned. Their names were whispered in the family's prayers and remembered silently by a fire. Because getting lost was sometimes not being forgotten, but turning into somewhere else. Vikings, therefore, both loved the wind and treated it with caution. The wind gives direction, opens paths. Sometimes it protects, but sometimes it draws a person in. Every journey was a sum of possibilities. Being lost and being found were among these possibilities, and Vikings walked knowing this. Stones under their feet, a silent wind over their heads, and a will inside always trying to find their direction. For Vikings, a new land was not just a gap on a map. It was also the door to the unknown, a beginning where hope and fear walked side by side. When small groups setting out from the crowded villages of Norway, Denmark, or Sweden hit the shore, sometimes caught in a storm, sometimes on purpose, and sometimes desperately, the landscape unfolding before their eyes was like a question of fate. Can we stay here? New lands were often desolate and silent. But Vikings knew that silence is not always safe. Behind it could be hidden enemies, wild animals, unknown diseases, or just the silent resistance of nature. That's why the first steps onto the land were taken carefully. Is the water drinkable? Is the soil suitable for planting? From where is the wind blowing? The answers to these questions determined not just survival, but permanence. Because Vikings did not look at every place they came to as temporary. For them, every new land was a possibility to build a home. Trees were cut, stones were collected, and the first shelters were made. Houses were built as they knew them, but the material was always different. The wood in Norway was not in Iceland. There was more stone in Greenland, but less soil. Everywhere, nature reminded them of its own rules again. Vikings did not fight these rules. They tried to solve them. Waterproof roofs, walls that cut the wind, structures close to the ground. Each was a form of resistance that came with experience. If farming was to be done, the soil was tested. In some places, it would not yield crops. Then they would turn to fishing. Fish were caught, dried, and salted. Animals were often brought along, but it was hard for them to survive in new lands too. Some adapted, some disappeared after the first winter, but the Vikings were used to it. They knew how to cope with losing and how to start over. If the community was small, security was the biggest issue. Night watches were kept, and incoming sounds were listened to. Whenever other communities were noticed nearby, then either peace was sought or conflict began. Vikings were not always pro-war. Sometimes sharing a bowl of milk could be as valuable as a treaty. But when a threat was perceived, there was no hesitation. Because in a new place, a moment of weakness could cause everything to be lost. When winter came, the real test began. The winter of new lands could be different from the winters they knew. How much wood was gathered? How many animals survived? Did the water sources freeze? These questions gained importance not by the day, but by the hour. In some places, there would be darkness lasting for months. On days when the sun did not rise, not only fire, but also stories provided warmth. Because fire was necessary for the body, and stories for the soul. And those stories usually began with the narrative of those who had set foot in another place for the first time, once upon a time. Children born in new lands, those who married locals, Vikings who continued their own traditions but changed according to the wind of the land they were in. Each was a result of this effort. Surviving was not just breathing. To adapt, to take root, not to be forgotten. That was the real matter. That is why, while the Vikings transformed the place they came to, they were also transformed themselves. Sometimes the place they came to accepted them. Sometimes it rejected them. But in both cases, the Vikings were not forgotten, because they left a trace behind everywhere. A rune carved in stone, the remains of a sunken boat, an old Norse name given to a child. Everything reminded of this struggle, trying to exist in the middle of the unknown. Surviving in new lands was possible not just with strength, but with patience and intelligence. Vikings knew this very well, and with this knowledge, they left a possibility on every shore, every island, every step. Maybe we will hold on here. Maybe we will build a home here. Maybe this will be our new beginning. Viking ships were strong but narrow, durable but uncomfortable. Every voyage meant a long journey, a door opening to the unknown, and a struggle with waves that sometimes lasted for weeks. Life on the ship was a rhythm shaped by patience. These boats, built on a wooden skeleton and having absorbed the salt of the sea over time, forced every person inside into the same thing when they set sail: resilience. Because these boats were not homes, but they had to be so for a while. Rowers sat shoulder to shoulder. Each determined their rhythm according to the breath of the next. The sound made when the oars entered the water echoed throughout the ship. This sound was sometimes encouraging, sometimes like a painful repetition. Rowing for hours was an occupation that tired not only the arms, but also the patience. And mostly, this effort was made without fully knowing where it was going, because it was the sky, along with the captain, that determined the route. The language of the clouds, the direction of the wind, and the shape of the waves. There was no map, only intuition. When it started to rain, there was no roof to take shelter under. Even gathering under the sail was not always possible. Water made clothes heavy, and breathing accelerated. But Vikings had accepted this. Getting wet was a part of setting out. Clothes were not dried because there was no fire to dry them. The body tried to cope with its own heat. That's why layers were worn, and woolen clothes were chosen. Wool kept some warmth even when wet. But no matter how prepared you were, it took courage to put that garment on your back in the early hours of the morning. Sleeping was perhaps the hardest thing on the ship. There was no space, no wall to lean your back on, no pillow to put your head on. Only a row of wood and another person sleeping next to you. As the waves rose, the body would be tossed. As the wind accelerated, eyes would open. Sleep was short, dreams were fragmented. It was necessary to be on alert at every moment. The ship could take on water, a storm could start, an attack could occur. Therefore, Vikings always slept with one ear open, and most of the time, those who were awake as day turned to night would memorize the position of a distant star. Maybe it would show the direction in the morning. Waiting was the longest lasting part of a sea voyage. Waiting for the wind to turn, the storm to subside, the land to appear. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, nothing would change. The horizon remained fixed, and the waves made the same sound. This wait raised one's inner voice. Conversations decreased, and everyone turned inward. Therefore, some Vikings did not just travel by sea. They also met themselves. Thoughts they had not heard before appeared in them, and memories came and went like waves hitting the shore. But there were also things shared within this difficult life. Small stories, silent laughs, the sharing of a piece of dried fish, all built warm bridges between the cold and the wind. A calm look from the captain, a friendly hand touching the rower's shoulder, a prayer said before the storm. These made life on the ship not just bearable, but meaningful. Because a boat floated not only on the water, but with the will of people. And finally, when land appeared, no one would shout. A silent, deep breath would be taken, and eyes would turn to one another. Everyone prepared to disembark from that journey as someone else, because every day spent at sea took a part from the person and put another part in its place. Vikings knew this. When setting out to sea, they delivered not only their hands, but their hearts to the ship. Belief and the spiritual world. When a storm broke out, Vikings did not just look at the sky. They also looked inside themselves, because for them, nature was not silent. It spoke. The wind shouted, lightnings grew angry, and waves became impatient. But sometimes this anger of nature was not just a physical event, but the gods' way of speaking silently. Especially Thor, as the master of the sky, was remembered as if giving a message in every thunder. But sometimes these messages were incomprehensible, and sometimes they did not come at all. Those moments were the hardest moments for the Vikings, times when the gods fell silent, when meaning evaporated. When a storm broke out, most Vikings instinctively turned their faces to the sky. While captains read the direction of the wind, they also looked at the shape of the clouds with narrowed eyes, because they saw the darkening in the sky not just as the beginning of rain, but as a divine warning. If the wind had strengthened and the waves had risen, but lightning had not struck, this could mean that Thor was silent. silence was sometimes heavier than shouting. Because for the Vikings, when the gods did not speak, a person had to search for what went wrong within himself. The silence of the gods was seen as a kind of trial. Illnesses, unsuccessful hunts, ships that lost their way. Each of these was sometimes a divine sign. Sometimes it was the silent form of punishment. Priests or wise old women would read the rune stones, interpret dreams, and try to make sense of the language of nature. But there were some days when no sign could be received. Then everyone turned inward. Perhaps a vow had been forgotten, a tradition broken, or land taken unjustly. In the moments when the gods were silent, people faced their own voices. Silence gave birth not only to fear, but also to responsibility. Because a God who does not speak leaves you alone with your own conscience. A Viking would think about what he did wrong in this silence. If necessary, he would repent and prepare small offerings. He would bury a figure in the ground or leave a piece of fish in the sea. These were not grand rituals, but small and deeply sincere gestures. Because Vikings did not perceive the gods as merely powerful, they also perceived them as fragile, breakable, and capable of taking offense. When the storm subsided, if the loss was small, he would interpret this as the gods beginning to speak again. But if the silence continued after the storm, then it meant the message had not yet been understood. As the silence lengthened, anxiety increased. Because when the language of nature stopped, the inner voice of man began to be heard more. And this voice was often filled with guilt, regret, and uncertainty. The silence of the gods was a deep metaphor in Viking society. It was a sense of void related not only to nature, but also to fate. Sometimes, although a battle was won, this silence would persist. Because victory was not always an indicator of being on the right path. Sometimes a small sign would come after a disaster. A wind would die down, a bird would fly, a stone would fall from its place, and this would be the breaking of the silence. In those moments, Vikings would take a deep breath again, straighten their backs, and believe that life continued. Silence was terrifying, but it was also instructive, because when the gods fell silent, Vikings began to think, and sometimes a storm would burst most inside them. When the sky opened, not only Jesus, but also understanding was reborn. That is why, even when the gods remained silent for the Vikings, the void spoke, and this speech could be more real than the sound of lightning. Death was not the end for Vikings, it was a door. But where this door would open was determined by how you stood while living, how you fought, and how you died. For them, the most supreme place was Odin's hall in the realm of the gods, Valhalla. It was the place where only those who died bravely could go, where great feasts filled with warriors were given, and where an eternal preparation was made. Because when the day of doom, Ragnarok, came, the souls gathered in Valhalla would take their place in Odin's army. And that is why, for a Viking warrior, not fearing death was not just a matter of courage. It was a belief, even a necessity. A warrior showing fear could shame not only himself, but his lineage. Someone fleeing the battlefield would not just fail to survive. His name would be forgotten. However, someone who did not let go of his sword until the last moment would be remembered with honor, even when he fell. The path to Valhalla was opened with this honor. For some, this dream sat at the center of life. Every fight was seen as a trial. If I die today, am I worthy? This question was asked silently, and the answer was given through behavior. The dream of Valhalla did not belong only to warriors. Women also carried this belief while seeing off their husbands and sons. Die with honor, do not fear, they would say, because they believed they would reunite there, in Valhalla. This belief made separation more bearable and made tears like nature. It was more important to remember with pride than to mourn, because fear consumed the one who remained alone, not the one who died. On some nights, young warriors would look at the sky and watch the northern lights. Some believed that these lights were the reflections of souls fighting in Valhalla. The green and purple lights gliding like a moving, wavy, silent dance seemed to open the curtain to another world. Each one would ask internally, "Will I have a place there?" But the answer to this question was hidden not in the future, but in how they lived at that moment. Fear of death was the most natural human emotion, but there was no room for this fear for Vikings. Because the one who fears makes his sword tremble. The one who trembles leaves an opening. The one who leaves an opening falls. Therefore, courage was a mandatory armor. Every morning when waking up, life was lived knowing that the day could be the last day. And if that day came, one should go with head held high, without turning away. Valhalla was a place not only for the strong, but also for those who had faith. The dream of Valhalla also reminded one of the transience of this world. For a Viking, the most precious thing was to leave an honorable name behind. Therefore, they feared being forgotten more than dying in battle. Not the one who couldn't go to Valhalla, but the one who wasn't remembered was considered lost. Living through stories, being mentioned in songs, living in the name of a child, this was true immortality, and Valhalla was the realm of those who deserved it. A Viking kneeling by the fire at night and praying would actually whisper not for death, but for a deserved place. May they not forget me. May my heart not tremble. May my sword not fall from my hand. This wish was valid not only for the moment of battle, but for every moment. Because the path to Valhalla was paved not only with the final blow, but with the will shown every day. In the world of the Vikings, the invisible and the visible were intertwined. It was believed that behind everything visible to the eye, there was another reality touched by nature and the gods. Therefore, daily life was surrounded not only by chores and wars, but also by rituals, prophecies, and sometimes dark beliefs. Because for Vikings, fate was not only a destiny, but a riddle to be understood. And this riddle was hidden sometimes within a dream, sometimes in the blood of a sacrifice, and sometimes in the circle of ravens in the sky. Rituals took place at every stage of society. A newborn child was introduced to the gods with a water ceremony. The first haircut became the sign of growing up. During harvest times, offerings were made to Mother Earth, Freya. Before a deceased person was buried, a prayer was made to Odin. While sacrifices were being made, the blood of the animal was poured onto certain stones. Prayers were recited in a specific order and with specific words. Because correct words would please the gods, a wrong step would be a harbinger of disaster. Therefore, meticulousness in rituals was the result of respect, not fear. Prophecies, on the other hand, were like the compass of society. Especially women seers, called vulvas, were considered sacred with the ability to see the future. It was said that they saw not with their eyes, but with their souls. In special rites performed by moonlight, they would enter a trance amidst the smoke prepared from herbs and interpret the whispers of the gods. Before an expedition, before a marriage, or just before a child was born, people would listen to their words, and the more uncertain the prophecy, the deeper it was considered. But not every prophecy gave peace. Some brought death. Sometimes a raven seen with its black feathers in a dream foretold an approaching war. Sometimes a woman would see a burning ship rising to the sky in her night sleep. This was interpreted as a funeral procession. These images were unavoidable, because Vikings believed that if fate was inescapable, it was more noble to face it. Prophecies did not frighten them. They made them prepared. Dark beliefs also belonged to this world. Respect for magic, curses, and the ancient gods was a part of daily life. In some houses, there would be small corners reserved for invisible beings. A piece of food or a drop of drink would be left there. Sometimes this was dedicated not directly to a god, but to Holdefolk, namely the hidden beings, so that they would protect goodness and keep diseases away. Because one did not clash with the invisible, one reconciled with it. Those who performed magic were not only well-intentioned. Black magic was feared. Especially talismans made with runic symbols could provide protection to a person as well as carry a curse. Therefore, every line carved on the stone was chosen with care. Misspelling someone's name could lead them to illness or loss. This information belonged only to special individuals, and these people were met with both respect and distance. At night, this dark knowledge was considered more effective. Stories whispered by the fire often revolved around a curse, a forgotten god, or an abandoned temple. Children listened to these stories as if spellbound, while elders nodded silently. They believed that what was told was not a rumor, but a reminder. Because in the Viking world, truth sometimes lay with those who remained silent. All these rituals, prophecies, and beliefs formed the invisible textures of Viking life. For them, life was lived not only with strength, but also with intuition. And this intuition was hidden in the direction of the wind, in the behavior of an animal, and in the whispers heard during night sleep. That's why Vikings would hide a bundle of herbs in their pockets even while carrying a sword, and would not forget to pray even when they heard the call to war. Because it was not possible to fight the visible without reconciling with the invisible. For Vikings, illness was a test of not only the body, but also the soul. Today's medicines, doctors, and diagnoses did not exist in their world, but nature did. Silently flowing rivers, cool forests, roots identified with pain, and healing herbs. Vikings looked to the hands of those who knew how to speak the language of nature. Because a wound did not just bleed. Sometimes it dried and became inflamed, and sometimes it deepened silently. At that point, things went beyond an ordinary treatment. That is when women called Seidrkona, or shamans, and men of knowledge came into play. These healers were seen as people who talked to nature. They believed that every stone, every plant, and every animal carried a meaning. To heal a wound, ointment alone was not enough. At the same time, it was necessary to understand why that wound was opened. Because, according to Viking belief, some diseases could result not just from wrong food or cold, but from the displeasure of the gods, the restlessness of ancestors, or the imbalance of the soul. For treatment, dried plants, animal fats, and special mixtures were often prepared at the edge of the forest. Medicinal herbs, for example, thyme, mint, wormwood, or bearberry, were each used against a different disease. Some were boiled, while others were pressed directly onto the wound. Healers paid attention not only to the season, but also to the phase of the moon, the direction of the birds, and the arrival of the wind when choosing herbs. Because for Vikings, nature was not just a source, but a guide carrying signs. However, in some cases, plants were not enough. Especially in long-lasting, recurring diseases of unknown cause, shamanic rituals came into play. Healer women would set up areas surrounded by special stones, burn incense, pray in ancient languages, and turn around the patient. Sometimes they would prostrate themselves on the ground, and sometimes they would look at the sky. This was not only a treatment, but a kind of agreement, a reconciliation ceremony. Spirits were called, gods were talked to, and forgiveness was sought from the ancestor spirits. Because some diseases were the reflection of a spiritual deterioration, not just a physical one. There would be healing songs sung throughout the night for children whose fever did not drop. For an adult who was delirious in his sleep, a piece of bone or a rune symbol was secretly placed under his pillow. These were not just practices, but beliefs. Belief was half of the healing, and these people did not underestimate the power of belief. Because Vikings knew that sometimes even words are as effective as ointment. Of course, not every treatment was successful. Some diseases resisted. When death approached silently, preparation was made rather than treatment. Figures symbolizing the gods were placed at the bedside of the dying person, so that the soul's journey would be easy. Sometimes a small fire was lit, and sometimes, instead of praying, hands were simply held. In those moments, remaining silent instead of speaking was considered the deepest form of healing. Although shamanic treatments seem far from science, they were a system and a balance in the Viking world. Everything was in harmony with nature. Healing was not only the body gaining strength again, but also its reharmonization with nature, the gods, and the past. That is why Vikings were able to survive not only because they were strong, but because they knew how to listen to nature, time, and silence. Women, family, and daily life. For Vikings, illness was a test of not only the body, but also the soul. Today's medicines, doctors, and diagnoses did not exist in their world, but nature did. Silently flowing rivers, cool forests, roots identified with pain, and healing herbs. Vikings looked to the hands of those who knew how to speak the language of nature, because a wound did not just bleed. Sometimes it dried and became inflamed, and sometimes it deepened silently. At that point, things went beyond an ordinary treatment. That is when women called Satyr Kona, or shamans, and men of knowledge came into play. These healers were seen as people who talked to nature. They believed that every stone, every plant, and every animal carried a meaning. To heal a wound, ointment alone was not enough. At the same time, it was necessary to understand why that wound was opened. Because, according to Viking belief, some diseases could result not just from wrong food or cold, but from the displeasure of the gods, the restlessness of ancestors, or the imbalance of the soul. For treatment, dried plants, animal fats, and special mixtures were often prepared at the edge of the forest. Medicinal herbs, for example thyme, mint, wormwood, or bearberry, were each used against a different disease. Some were boiled, while others were pressed directly onto the wound. Healers paid attention not only to the season, but also to the phase of the moon, the direction of the birds, and the arrival of the wind when choosing herbs. Because for Vikings, nature was not just a source, but a guide carrying signs. However, in some cases, plants were not enough. Especially in long-lasting, recurring diseases of unknown cause, shamanic rituals came into play. Healer women would set up areas surrounded by special stones, burn incense, pray in ancient languages, and turn around the patient. Sometimes they would prostrate themselves on the ground, and sometimes they would look at the sky. This was not only a treatment, but a kind of agreement, a reconciliation ceremony. Spirits were called, gods were talked to, and forgiveness was sought from the ancestor spirits. Because some diseases were the reflection of a spiritual deterioration, not just a physical one, there would be healing songs sung throughout the night for children whose fever did not drop. For an adult who was delirious in his sleep, a piece of bone or a rune symbol was secretly placed under his pillow. These were not just practices, but beliefs. Belief was half of the healing, and these people did not underestimate the power of belief. Because Vikings knew that sometimes even words are as effective as ointment. Of course, not every treatment was successful. Some diseases resisted. When death approached silently, preparation was made rather than treatment. Figures symbolizing the gods were placed at the bedside of the dying person, so that the soul's journey would be easy. Sometimes a small fire was lit, and sometimes instead of praying, hands were simply held. In those moments, remaining silent instead of speaking was considered the deepest form of healing. Although shamanic treatments seem far from science, they were a system and a balance in the Viking world. Everything was in harmony with nature. Healing was not only the body gaining strength again, but also its reharmonization with nature, the gods, and the past. That is why the Vikings were able to survive, not only because they were strong, but because they knew how to listen to nature, time, and silence. A Viking day from the first light of morning until night. While the night slowly withdrew, the pale lights appearing on the eastern horizon were like the harbinger of a new day. The wind filtered through the forests of the north, wandering over the roofs of the village, passing through the thatched roofs, and nudging the lingering slumbers of the night one by one. The roosters had not yet crowed, but you could tell by the direction of the wind and the slight hum between the wooden houses. Morning was coming. In a small Viking village, the morning did not wake anyone suddenly. Time flowed in its own rhythm here. Eyes opened slowly. The body would take refuge under the quilt for a while longer, so as not to lose the heat it had held throughout the night. But the world outside would not maintain its patience for long. There were chores to be done, animals to be fed, wood to be gathered, and fires to be prepared. The day would not wait. One of the first to wake was the old woman Gunhild. Her back had become a bit more hunched with the burden of years, but her hands were still strong. She got up to check the fire. She stirred the embers inside the hearth that had not gone out through the night. She threw a few dry twigs on them. As the heat rose slowly, the inside of the house began to fill with the first breath of the day. Everything was silent. This silence was precious, because shortly it would be replaced by footsteps, children's laughter, the bleating of sheep, and the barking of dogs. At that moment, Eric, a boy who had just turned 12, was watching the outside through the small window of the house, squinting at the sun. Today was not an ordinary day for him. He was going to the field with his father for the first time, standing at the plow, and learning how the soil was opened. This was one of the small but meaningful steps toward leaving childhood. He was excited but trying not to show it. Viking children grew up early. The seriousness at the corners of his eyes was the silent sign of this. In front of the small pen next to their house, Thorstein, Eric's father, was chopping wood with an axe in his hand in the very first minutes of the morning. Every stroke left an echo in the air. Freshly cut wood spread a warm scent against the cold morning air. For Thorstein, The day did not consist only of tasks to be done. He saw the morning as a kind of time of purification. Mistakes made yesterday were corrected today, and if a wrong word had been spoken, it was silenced by disappearing within nature. At the other end of the village, the old Volva Isa, kneeling for her morning prayer, looked at the day through different eyes. Her eyes were considered blind, but she could feel the rising light on her skin. She had raised her hands to the sky, whispering silently to the gods. This was a sight everyone in the village was used to. No one would fully start work until her prayer began. Because for a day to be fruitful, it was not only about physical effort, but also about the soul's readiness. As the Volva's prayer ended, the wind suddenly changed direction. This was a good sign for her. Today was an auspicious day. Slowly, smoke began to rise from the other houses as well. Mothers woke the children. Small hands washed faces with cold water. In some houses, oatmeal was boiling. In others, they were preparing to spend the morning with remaining slices of bread. Viking tables were simple but warm. Sharing came before taste. Younger siblings sat next to their elders and waited for them to be full first. This was the silent rule in the house. Respect began at the table as well. In the village square, young men carried oats to the horses. Women inspected the knots of the nets. As for the elders, they sat on the grass, warming their hands. Everyone had a duty. There was no job too small or too big. Because life here was like a chain. If one link was missing, the whole system was strained. That's why, even if you were a child, you would definitely have a job to do in the mornings. No one started the day idle. When the shadows began to lengthen, preparation for the second half of the day would begin. This time, things became a little harder. The heat increased and fatigue was felt, but still, no step backward was taken. The plow in the field was taken up again, more wood was brought from the forest, and dried fish were gathered and hung on the line. Children remained a bit more free during these hours. But freedom did not mean play. They too helped their mothers, carried water, kept the fire alive, and watched and learned the work of the elders. For Vikings, learning began with seeing. Questions were not asked, observations were made. In the afternoon, the village elders held a small meeting. If a big decision was to be made, or if who would take on which task was to be discussed again, this time period was preferred. Usually, they sat around the large stone in the square, crossing their legs, and everyone spoke in turn. This was not an argument. It was the sharing of common wisdom. Everyone listened, and they remained silent until the person speaking finished their words. Young people did not attend these meetings, but watched silently from afar, because it was known that one day they too would sit there. During the middle hours of the day, animals were checked, the pen was cleaned, and the water troughs were inspected. For Vikings, animals were not just food, but a part of shared life. The eyes of the cows were red, the wool of the sheep was felt by hand, and the coats of the dogs were brushed. A silent language was established with the animals. They were not shouted at or gotten angry with, because loyalty was established not by force, but by respect. Thorstein's dog, Skoll, always walked a step behind him, as if knowing when to stop and when to move. As the day slowly turned to the west Everyone made their final preparations for the evening. But that moment had not yet arrived. The surroundings were still warm, and the shadows were still short. But deep down, everyone felt the sun beginning to tilt. Because Vikings measured time not by the sun, but by the language of the shadow. And that language had now begun to curl slowly toward the end of the day. As the sun slowly tilted toward the west, the light over the village turned to a golden color. Every object's shadow had lengthened, and the footprints on the soil had turned into lines. Eric felt the fatigue settling deep into his body as he walked behind his father. His arms were heavy, and his knees were stiff. But this fatigue was not annoying. On the contrary, it was peaceful. He had worked with the soil all day, carried water, watched the animals, and listened to the silent conversations of the people. Now he too was a part of this cycle. His small hands were slowly entering a great life. By the lakeside, the fishermen were making preparations. The nets had been left in the water overnight. Despite fingers becoming numb while pulling the nets from the surface of the cold waters in the morning, it was necessary to work. Because the fish on the evening table was possible through this silent effort of the morning. The old fisherman Hrafn, as he did every morning, first looked at the water and whispered, quote 12. These were his prayers. They were neither written nor loud, but for years the water had always heard him. When the day rose a bit, the stillness of the morning began to give way to tempo. Those going to the field set out. Breaking the hard crust of the soil with the tip of the plow was a complicated task. But that soil had waited under the snow all winter. Now it was ready to wake up slowly. While Eric held the plow for the first time beside his father, his hands trembled. Thorsten did not even watch him. He just whispered. Quote 13. As the sun slowly rose, the tones of the sky began to turn from pale orange to bright white. The coolness of the morning had given way to a slight warmth, and the Viking village had now fully awakened. Everyone had dispersed to their own work. The soil had been pierced by the plow. The nets had been pulled from the water. Children had begun carrying water and stacking wood. There was a silent tempo in everything. No one was shouting or rushing, yet everything proceeded in a certain order, just like time itself. At the edge of the field, Eric's hands now held the plow more firmly. The shaky touches of the morning had given way to a controlled strength. His father, Thorstein, watched him from the corner of his eye every now and then, but said nothing. Because this silence was a sign of trust. Words are not always necessary. In the village square, the women had finished their morning tasks and begun preparing for lunch. Most of the time, this meal consisted of the meat of an animal hunted the previous day, or the fish caught in the morning. Meat boiled in large cauldrons was served with dry bread. Everyone took their meal in turn, first the elderly, then the children, and finally the young men. This order was not only for respect, but to maintain the order itself. After Eric took his bread, he sat in a shadow. His hands still smelled of soil. He began to eat without even wiping the mud smeared on his face. This exhaustion gave him a strange peace. After the meal, everyone would rest for a short time. This was a rare time frame in Viking days. Sitting in a silent shade, pulling one's knees to the chest and leaving the feet to the sun that warmed them, some would lean their heads against the stone and close their eyes. Some would gaze at the horizon. Some would tell a memory from their childhood to the person next to them. But most of the time, This rest also passed in silence. Because the bodies, tired from the morning's activity, now tried to recover themselves. Fires began to be lit in the village square. A hearth in front of every house, faces around every hearth. Flames were rising, sparks were being scattered into the sky. The cold of the night had not yet settled, but everyone wanted to get close to the fire. Because Viking nights were lived around the fire. It was both a narrative space and a haven of silence. Some were warming their hands, some were sitting silently, and some were slowly starting to speak. The language of the day was work. The language of the night was remembering. Thorstein crouched by the hearth with tired steps. In front of him was a rabbit slowly browning. He looked at Eric sitting next to him from the corner of his eye. The boy's face was mixed with soot, but his eyes were shining. He didn't ask, quote 14. He didn't need to ask, because the tired glow in his son's eyes showed that the answer had already been given long ago. In that look, there were words like, quote 15, quote 16, quote 17, but they were all silent. Vikings often did not talk. They lived. At another hearth, old Hrafn was looking at the fire while turning the wooden spoon in his hand. The youths crouched beside him were listening to him. Hrafn started with an old story, as always. Perhaps he had told it 100 times, but no one was bored. Because Viking stories did not age. Every time they were told, a new layer was opened. Every word warmed the night a little more. The story that began with, quote, 18, was slowly falling into everyone's mind like a picture. The women had taken the children beside them, silently spinning wool and turning small stone figures in their fingers. Some children were falling asleep, and some were dreaming while looking at the stars. The sky was clear. The northern lights had not yet appeared, but everyone knew they would come. Because nights in this village were never completely dark. Nature always finds a light, and that light shines most at night. In the later hours of the night, the vulva of the village, the wise woman, sat in the middle of a small circle. Young women, a few children, and some men gathered around her. She closed her eyes silently. There was a piece of herb in each of her palms. A light wind blew. The vulva began to whisper the names of the gods. The words were very old. Even if the meaning was unknown, the effect was felt. This was not a prayer, but a reminder, a ceremony of surviving, being together, and establishing a bond between the past and the future. Then everyone was silent for a while. Only the crackling of the fire was heard. Everyone was thinking something internally, but no one was saying it. Because these hours were not for talking, but for feeling. Eric leaned his head on his father's shoulder. His eyes were about to close. Behind his eyelids, everything he had seen throughout the day began to appear. The soil opened by the plow, his mother's hands, old Hrafn's voice, the dog's eyes, the fish in the net, and the first star in the sky. One more day had passed, silently but leaving deep traces. For the Vikings, the end of another day was not just the passing of time, but the completion of another link in the chain of life. The day was full of labor, and the night was full of memories. And to be able to start anew in the morning, one first had to pass through the interior of this night. The fires slowly began to die out. People retreated to their houses. The ashes of the hearths would preserve their warmth until morning. The last thing Eric heard as he slept was a woman whispering a slight lullaby. Although he could not make out the words, the melody was familiar enough, because every child in this village grew up with this melody, and every day closed with this song, and throughout the night the northern lights were finally spread across the sky. They glided like green, purple, and blue waves through the stars. They were like the eyes of the gods. They were looking from above, watching the life below. Perhaps they were satisfied, because today, too, everyone had lived as they should have. Yes, dear listener, tonight, as every night, we have come to the end of a story. I hope you have slept. See you tomorrow night. Good night.